Hi folks, this tutorial is a tutorial basically showing you the mark build process for English grade 8 at Home Language Term 2, kind of a follow on from the first one I did, which was for grade 9. And as I've explained before, if you can start to learn how to build the formulas from these, specifically the home languages in phase 3, you'll get a good idea of how to put them together for almost any, although I will do more tutorials to try and cover as many of the sort of permutations that are out there. But as I say, these tend to be the most complex, and once you see how we break it down, it's actually not too bad. So the first thing I'm going to do is just put together, so this is just a mock sort of blank template that I work from just to do my workings on. So what I'm going to do is just put in the columns that you'll be seeing on your mark sheet that you receive. So as you know already, you only see the columns where you have to enter marks onto. In other words, you don't see these calculated columns on your mark sheets. Well, you don't see the calculated columns except for when tasks carry into other columns as activities. Those ones you do see. And again, I'll urge you, just to cover this probably at the beginning of all my tutorials, to also watch the tutorials in the other phases, even if you're, say, a primary school and you're going to go up to grade 7, to watch the 8 and 9s and vice versa, because it will shed light for you on how these things work. Like, for example, just to mention quickly, in the grade 7s, if you look at this area here where the task, the oral task for term 1 comes into the picture, and they do like a little calculation here, and this calculation, you can see this task is weighted 0. In other words, it's got no bearing on the term 2 mark, but they do this little calculation here so that they can generate a mark for this section, which becomes part of the mark for task 6. Now, given the fact that the oral task 2 is already the first oral activity of term 2 is already the first task, okay, so in other words, it represents 30% of the mark. It then can also be part of the task 3, so it kind of counts twice in a sense. It counts 30% of the overall mark, and then it counts 30% of task 6, which counts 40% of the overall mark for term 2. Now, in the grade, and I've done explanations for 7, 8 and 9, so I've explaining how this all works, but I didn't do the mark build side of it. In other words, the report mark formula build side of it, as those were just explanations. So if you watch those, you'll know what I'm talking about. But essentially, just to recap, in the grade 9s, you'll see that this mark here, okay, where they do this calculation section, oral 1 does come into the picture, and so this mark that's generated here does include oral 1 and oral 2. So, and then that spits itself across into the third task for term 2. So the third task for term 2, 30% of the mark is made up of a combination of oral 1 and oral 2, depending on how they weight it over here in grade 9. This is covered in the explanation tutorials. Whereas in grade 8, only the term 2 element counts in this segment of the third task. In other words, you can see here oral 2 gets carried out into this calculation section. Oral 1 does as well, but they weight at 0. So it doesn't actually count towards this mark over here, which gets spat out into the third task as 30% of the third task. You'll see in grade 7 that none of this actually counts. So they still have this calculation patch, and they still have the mark jumping into the third task, but it's weighted 0, and these two weightings here for the other two components of the third task equal 100. I think it's 40 and 60 or something to that effect. so it doesn't count at all. So it's sort of in a sense like they have this template for 7, 8, and 9, where, like I say, in grade 9 it makes use of the full template, so to speak, but in grade 8 they only use the oral 2 component as to count again, and in grade 7 they don't use any of the orals, neither 1 or 2, to count again. So, but they retain the same template, so that's why they just sort of weight this naught, and then, as I say, in grade 7 they weight this section naught as well. So it's useful to cover all of these. So essentially, and the reason I started talking about that is you do actually see these columns in the mark sheet, but as I explained in the explanation section, you can ignore them, and I'll show you exactly how that plays out now. So I'm just going to write down the things that you would see in sorry, let's go. Okay, then you would see this column here, because that's a mark entry point, and then you would see those two there, 45 and 0 and 15 and 100, and you would see the 30 and the 30 and the 40, and the 40 and 30, and you would see that and that. And obviously in your mark sheet you will see the task and activity numbers at the top, and as I've explained before, where the task numbers are the same, that is telling you that those activities are within the same task. So for example, you would look at these two columns would have the same task number at the top, they fall under the same, and you don't have to know that, it's just helps to make a little bit more sense of what you're looking at. And these three here, which represent these three columns, would fall into the same task. Now, so because these columns, these task columns that are calculated columns aren't shown in the mark sheet, we didn't want to have all these calculation columns in the mark sheets so that people weren't confused, and they didn't have to put little calculation formulas all over inside the mark sheets. Why we just wanted to put mark entry points into the mark sheet. So you'll see when you build the formula, for instance, when I have to weight these three columns, we don't actually have this 40 to reference, and that's why in the formula we'll sometimes just hard code the number 40 into the formula, and you'll see what I mean as you go through more of the mark build or formula build tutorials. So okay, the first thing we do, and I like to kind of use a process, if you like, or a template of understanding to be able to build these things. So the first thing I do is I say, well, look, there are three tasks. Okay, task 1, task 2, well, and they're called task oral 2, 5, and 6, but task 1, 2, and 3. Okay, and they're weighted 40, 30, and 30. Okay, so the first thing is, and so I know if I get the mark to a mark out of 30, and a mark out of 30, and a mark out of 40, I can just add them together, and that will give me the exact mark that SASAMS calculates as well. So I know I'll have 3 sections, and I need to just turn them into a mark out of 30, a mark out of 30, and a mark out of 40. So, look, if you're not following 100% at this stage, don't worry. I'm just kind of setting the stage, so to speak, and the more of these you watch and the more practice you get, the more you'll understand. So yeah, basically let's crack on with the formula. So, alright, the first segment, you're going to be obviously dividing the mark by the test total, and you want to turn it into a mark out of 15. Alright, so multiply that by 15. But now the important thing is that you'll see that when that mark gets into this task column, it actually rounds off. I mean, if you were to do a calculation, in this case, you would find a decimal, 13.2. If you were to write the formula without rounding it and retain that decimal, you'll come to a different answer. So you'll see that in SASAMS, intermittently, it drops decimals because of the fact that they turn these activities into tasks. So, which is why I like to do, the segment plus segment plus segment method to get there, because what we need to do now is we need to round this. Okay. So the way you do that is you type in the round function, you open the bracket, and now you're going to, at the end of your calculation, put a comma which tells it how many. You can see the IntelliSense here at the bottom, right? We've done the number, which is D9 divided by D7 multiplied by 15, and the number of decimals we want to hold it to, which is 0, so it's going to round to a whole number, and then close the round statement. So you've got the whole thing inside of your first segment brackets. I mean, you'll notice that as we go through more and more of these formulas, and some of the formulas you would have picked up straight from the formula sheet that I've put out, sometimes I have more brackets than I need. I mean, I needn't have these outer brackets necessarily in this particular thing, but it's just an organizational thing. It's just a neat thing. It's just to be able to encapsulate things and control things in their segments, so to speak. Okay, so that's the first segment. The second segment follows a similar vein. Oh, sorry, that isn't the first segment. So, alright, so we've got it to a mark out of 15. Now we have to get that mark out of 15 into a mark out of 30. I mean, we could just double it because we know that 15 times 2 is 30, but, to do it properly, what you have to do is divide the mark, so 13 divided by 15, and then convert it to a mark out of 30. And again, that's why it's important that we round. Let's say that decimal was 13.3, and we converted it to a mark out of 30, you're going to land up at 26.6. which becomes 27. So the child would be getting, of the 30% for the task that counts 30%, he'd be getting 27 of that percent. Okay, whereas if it's rounded at 13, so it's 13.3, it's rounded down to 13, converted to a mark out of 30 is 26. So it's, it can go up an entire percentage. So it's important at this point that we put it in. So okay, we've got, so let's encapsulate the whole story, and we'll go divided by 15, okay, and multiplied by 30. Okay, now that is the first segment as a mark out of 30, the first 30% of the entire mark. Then on to the second segment. And a similar thing here, except that in this case we don't have to convert, it's out of 45, so we don't have to convert it to a mark out of 45. Okay, so we're simply saying that divided by that. Okay. And we simply want to convert that straight into a mark out of 30. So we can simply say multiplied by 30. So that is the second segment sorted out. So, okay, now it gets slightly more complicated, but if we follow carefully, we'll know what it's doing. Right, so in this next section, basically what we need to do for the third section is we need to arrive at these 3 marks. Okay, the first mark we need to arrive at, which is a bit of a calculation on its own. So essentially, again, if we just return to the formula working sheet, there are 3 segments, 1, 2, 3, that make up the last mark. So again, what I like to do is I like to put in my segments plus arguments, if you like. Right, so in the first one, again, we are now going to kind of replicate this calculation in order to arrive at this point over here. Because of the 3 segments, we are needing to calculate this first segment. So just to make it sort of less confusing on the mark sheet, what I'm going to do is I'm going to say that we don't actually need to be using any of these cells over here. Oh, sorry, it's gone in. Okay, so I'm going to read them out. And you might say, okay, well, I can understand why you're reading these 2 out here, because we'll do this calculation on its own. Why are you reading out the first segment of the 3 segments? And again, it's because we're going to replicate what this does in the calculation here. So we already know that this mark is out of 30. We already had this segment over here where we turned the mark into a mark out of 30. Okay, so in other words, you can see the calculation comes across here. There's the term 1 mark, but it's weighted 0. So it doesn't, even though it is sitting here in combination with the second term oral mark, it's weighted 0, and so it's only the second term oral mark that counts towards this calculated task, for want of a better word, that then spits itself across into the first segment or the first activity of the 3rd task. So essentially we just want to arrive at this mark, 26 out of 30, which we've already done. You can see that this is out of 30 over here. So basically we can just pull that calculation across to the first part of the calculation in the 3rd task. Sorry, I'm going to remove that 1 bracket and that 1 bracket there. Yeah, that's right, so we're rounding that, but there's the round function. Alright, there's what you're rounding, and that bracket encapsulate the whole thing. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to copy this whole bit, okay, inside the first calculation. I'm going to put it into, so I'm taking the first calculation, I'm going to put it into, in other words, the first task, into the first part of the oral calculation. Okay, so that's the first part done. Then it's going to be plus the second calculation, right, which is that divided by that multiplied by that. Okay, and we're going to put in the 3rd part of that calculation as that divided by that multiplied by that. Okay, so the mark divided by the test total multiplied by the weighting. Okay, now that first mark is out of 30, the second mark is out of 30, and the 3rd mark is out of 40, and we added them together in this segment. So we've now arrived at a mark for the 3rd section out of 100. Okay, but it's weighted as 40, right? So in other words, we want to firstly round this off. Okay, it's because the marks, when the marks calculated in SAMS under the task columns are always rounded off before they get converted into their weighted component. So we are going to round off this entire section. So inside there we go. Sorry. Round. And at the end of the entire section we created, you can see the IntelliSense picking it up. We're in the right area. Okay, so we've rounded that entire segment off. And now what we need to do is convert that mark out of 100 to a mark out of 40. So what you do is you say divided by 100 multiplied by 40. Okay. And that, folks, should be the formula. As I say, just to recap, we've done the first bit, right, where we, let's just pull this down a bit, where we turned the mark into a mark out of, took the mark out of 25 and turned it into a mark out of 15, rounded it off, and then turned it into a mark out of 30 as being the first component. So there's your first component. We took the second mark, which was a little simpler, and it was a mark out of 45 already turned into a mark out of 45 for the task, and turned that into a mark out of 30. Okay, and no rounding required because the mark out of 40 turns into a mark out of 40. It's unitary, so there would be no decimals involved. And then the third segment, within which there are 3 segments, should I say activities. I get used to calling them segments in my mind as I work through these things. And so that's the first section, which is basically a replication of the term 2 oral, as we see that term 1 oral in the case of grade 8 doesn't come into the picture. Turns into a mark out of 30. Okay, then the second part of the third task, right, which was comprehension, and the third part of the third task, which was writing, essay, etc. And we then converted that into its mark out of 40. Okay, so that first task was a mark out of 30, the second task a mark out of 30, and the last task a mark out of 40. And as I say, that arrives at your report mark, and then we can just test quickly so you can see the marks that I have in already. Let's say we've got 22 here in this. Okay, let's say we didn't put a mark in here into SASAMS, so let's just give these marks of say 28, and this one's a low one, so we'll go 17. Okay, so let's just say we got 41 in here, and simply the other marks you would enter in here. Let's say they got 20, so that's out of 40, so 37, say 18, 25, say 17, say 28, say 17, say 9. Okay, right, so we'll do the same on our mark sheet at the bottom. (17), 11, 28, 17, 37, 25, 17, 28, 17, 9. Okay, and you can see that the first mark in SASAMS 89.73 is matching up perfectly to your mark sheets. We copy that, we paste it down. So now you have a mark sheet that replicates SASAMS, and in which you can, sorry, one other thing. A good thing I did that so that we remember that when you, let's have a look here. You see, so you have references in your formula where you reference the mark, which return back to the test totals, okay, and in some cases even the weightings of each test. And when you copy and paste the formula down, what you want is the formula to iterate. So in other words, where it's dealing with D9, it must now deal with D10 and D11 and so on. But you don't want the test totals or any of the things that you reference at the top here to iterate. You want it to keep referring back to the cell. You want to keep it constant. And I always talk about the 6s and 7s. So all you have to do is go through your formula and tell the 6s and 7s that they must be constant. So the way you do that is you look for any row 7 and any row 6 and you put a $ in front of it. Okay, so 7, there's a 7, okay, D7, and I7, and I6, and J7, and J6. Right, so that means that when you copy and paste your formula down, it will iterate for the learners, but it will stay constant for the totals that you reference at the top. Okay, and there you go, that's a bit better. So it's handy to make mistakes in the tutorial sometimes, because we all go through the learning process together, and you can see that the marks being represented in SASAMS equal exactly your mark sheets. And again, the beauty of that is you now have Excel mark sheets that can push marks through to SASAMS directly, as well as push marks through to your reports in FrontOFFICE that are producible for teachers where there are splits, which you can't do in SASAMS, and of course as well, which you're able to use on any device. You're able to capture anywhere you are, and as well as store in the cloud, and capture across in the cloud, and for the marks to be imported whether you're at school or not. So that concludes this tutorial. The next tutorial is going to be the same thing, but for grade 7 English Home Language.